Good morning, everyone. My name is Abdallah. I'm happy to be here with you today. Shukran, Dr. Ahmed. Thanks for the organizers who invited me. It's a pleasure and honor to be here with you. Economics is always a little bit a tricky topic when it comes to discussion, especially public discussion. I'll try my best, my very level best, not to be so techy, so technical. There are plenty of numbers, so to speak, plenty of numbers to crash in 15 minutes presentation. However, I prepared like an agenda of hopefully to be done in 15 minutes. I chose a couple of forms of violence. I believe the gentlemen after me, the presenters, will cover that in depth, the different forms of violence and different aspects. However, myself, I'm going to focus on a couple of them and link them to 3 socioeconomic indicators. So again, I don't want to be a reductionist, but I have to, as much as possible, allow the material to really be presented in 15 or 20 minutes. However, I'll be happy to take any questions during the Q&A panel discussion. So on our agenda, we'll see about a couple of forms of violence. We're going to focus on socioeconomic indicators, what correlations we have between them, and conclusions and recommendations. And again, the conclusions and recommendations are my own, happy to be challenged, happy to be discussed with you as we move on. So in terms of various forms of violence, just let me take this out. I prefer to be on the move. Yeah. So I chose to focus on two main forms of violence because I believe these are like really based on what Dr. Ahmed was talking in the morning. We have some serious issues arising. Domestic violence, women and child abuse is on the rise, unfortunately, and political violence and extreme violence, particularly among youth. So political violence and extreme violence are kind of linked to different things, but they are linked. I'm not suggesting that every political violence is necessarily extreme violence, but we're gonna talk about it. Crime and poverty violence, conflicts and wars. Of course, conflict and wars is on its own a huge topic with geopolitical and geoeconomics impacts, but we might need a couple of hours to cover that. So I chose 3 socioeconomic factors that I believe are important to be discussed today. And as you see graphically, the graphics suggest that these are all intertwined, they are linked. So they lead to each other, they move each other. And they are relative. There's nothing we're gonna talk about as much as possible today that's absolute, in absolute terms. We're gonna see relative. So when we say poverty, it's one of the major drivers of violence, of course, and economic inequality, and then the ISAD, which is the index of relative socioeconomic advantage and disadvantage. I'll try to translate this to Arabic, and I used all AI websites to try to translate it. But the most important word in it is relative. Everything we're going to talk about is relative. So let's see poverty. Gandhi says poverty is the worst form of violence. Among scholars, among economists, among money studies, we don't really need to prove again that poverty leads to violence. Let's see what is poverty in Australia. And again, when I say relative, when we say Australia is a rich country, right? So we cannot compare a poor person in Australia to a poor person in Africa or India or anywhere else in the world, where really the level of violence in these countries is high. However, we cannot take things for granted. So when we say poverty, let's see numbers, what numbers suggest about poverty in Australia. Around 3 million Australians living in poverty in 2022. How do we define poverty in Australia? There are multiple ways. This study, and by the way, all the numbers that you're going to see here today are based from reports So I'm happy to share all the reports. There are international, local reports by the Australian government, by different government sectors, international like the UNDP, World Bank, etc. So happy to share all of these documents, whoever requires them to go in depth. So when we define poverty, it's any family or household living with an income that is 60% or less of the median income. Median income is the middle income. So 50% of Australians earn more than the median income, and 50% earn less than the median income. So people who are considered living in poverty in Australia are the people who earn 60% of the median income. The median income, and the latest figures, is around $55,000 on an annual basis. So people living less than $30,000 a year are considered to be living in poverty in Australia. We see in the graph that, do I have a pointer? No. We see in the graph that there was a spike, immediate spike during COVID for understandable reasons, but then the government intervention has helped to bring that down. However, we are today back to the level of 16-17%. So there are around between 15 and 17% of Australians living in poverty. More importantly, one in 6 Australian children or child live in poverty. So this is 761,000 children who live in poverty in Australia today. And there are 2 million Australian households who are living in food insecurity. So this is also another way of measuring poverty. So when a certain household or a family cannot afford the basics, when we say basics, we mean food, so they will skip a meal, or they cannot pay rent, or they cannot pay energy bills. These are necessities. When families are struggling with those, some firms or some researchers consider them as poor and the poverty. Now, why I'm not so much optimistic about the graph, because if we see the main drivers of poverty, the high cost of living. Welcome to the high cost of living. It's news. It's in the news everywhere, right? We've been speaking about publicly on the news for the past couple of years. There is an increase in housing unaffordability, or especially among the youth. Young people in Australia are not able to afford buying houses. We will see how this impacts upward mobility and how this increase violence in a while. Job security, there's a trend in job casualization. You see the numbers that was floated today, a couple of days ago. Unemployment rate in Australia is currently at 4.1%. It was less than 4 a couple of months ago. However, 4.1% is considered still a good number in international terms, but the trend is the number of hours. Number of hours is decreasing. Number of hours worked is decreasing in Australia. There are multiple jobs that are being casualized. Casualization of jobs is not a healthy economic indicator. So it leads to insecurity. Insecurity leads potentially to violence. Access to health services, there's a huge strain on the public health services in Australia. People who can afford it are resorting to private funds, but people who cannot afford it have to wait for months and weeks to get access to public service, public health service. And there are the unequal opportunities to access education. Have you heard of Sydney Latte Line? Not the coffee. There's an imaginary line called Latte Line, which virtually split Sydney into 2 areas. One area, which is mostly the east, the north, and the northwest, and another area which is upper area called the blue area, and another area called the red area, which is southwest and the rest of the west. This is what the red area. This is based on the NAPLAN results. So, Sydney Latte line, most of our public schools here score under the NAPLAN, average NAPLAN result. And it gets worse from year 3 to year 5 to year 9 because LGA with economic disadvantage cannot afford to go to private schools, or even if they are in public schools, cannot afford private tuition, etc., etc. So this is shocking as someone who came to the country almost 12 years ago, and when I first heard about it, it was for me a wake-up call that there's something wrong, and this has to be fixed, and we'll talk about it in a while. The second indicator is inequality, economic inequality. We imagine economic inequality with two indices. The income inequality, so the distribution of income, and wealth inequality. So one way of measuring inequality is what we call Gini index. So Gini is a number between 0 and 1. 1 means total inequality. So when we speak about income, it means a certain economy has one person earning everything, and the rest are earning 0. 0 means all the income is equally divided among people. The same applies to wealth. Wealth, if one person owns the entire wealth in the country, the coefficient will be 1. If the wealth is equally distributed among citizens, the Gini will be 0. We don't have a big problem in Australia in income inequality, but we have a huge problem in wealth inequality. Wealth is unevenly distributed in Australia. Almost 50% of wealth is owned by the top 10%. And the rest, the lower 60% owns only 17% of the wealth. And when we say wealth, we talk about owner-occupied houses, shares and businesses, superannuation, investment properties, boats, you name it, all the assets and properties. And there's robust empirical evidence that unequal societies tend to have higher level of violence as well as low social trust. And social trust among peers, among citizens, and social trust and the trust between citizens and the government. So this is another relative index, we say. So if we compare ourselves to liberal democracies, we are the 4th highest in terms of wealth inequality. Before us, there is the US, UK, and Portugal. And then there's us. This is not good. Now, the third index I want to talk about is part of the census. Census, they measure something called CFA, Socio-Economic Index for Areas, for LGA. But I'm going to focus a little bit more about the ISA, Index of Relative Socio-Economic Advantage, ISAT, disadvantage and disadvantage. We're going to see what the numbers suggest. So this is Australia-wide. Right? In major cities, you would see that in major cities, typically, there are areas that are more advantaged than remote cities in Australia. We're going to see a little bit New South Wales in a while, and the link between that particular index and domestic violence. The way ISAT is measured, they take into consideration income, education, so education opportunities, employment opportunities, occupation, whether laborers, technicians, managers, etc. And as I said, education attainment, the percentages of people living in a certain LGA with higher education, etc. The housing, whether you own the house, whether you are renting, or whether you own it straight, or you are paying certain mortgage, and certain social factors, which is mostly family structure, single parents, etc. So they take all of these into consideration to measure ISAT in census. So this data is collected during census every 5 years, and then the index is generated. So the impact of this on domestic violence. It's proven that domestic violence is higher in socio-economic disadvantaged areas. I'm gonna show you here. So this is IRSAT in New South Wales, and this is the rate of domestic violence on the right, domestic violence per 100,000 population. You can see that there's clear correlation between areas of high economic disadvantage will have high rate of domestic violence. These are the numbers suggesting that in terms of different LGAs. And this number as well, so if we divide the IRSAT into 5 quantiles, the lowest 20%, you can see the proportion of women being subject to domestic violence is higher with lowest quintile and gets lower with highest quintile. So that is, and the other also graphics show that depends on the socio-economic ranking, then families or households on the lowest side of the socio-economic ranking have higher number of offenses being reported in these households. So there's a clear relation between these two. I'm going to leave that part. Quickly, 69% of women in Australia leave properties and assets when they leave certain abusive relationship. So there's a huge personal economic factors. And on the economy-wide, it cost us $22 billion to fix domestic violence issues. All sorts of issues. Now, on the relationship between socioeconomic factors and political and extreme violence. Now, there's broad academic consensus that there's no single factor, and I'll leave that point to the gentleman later on to talk more about it. So, poverty does not equally mean extreme violence. So poverty does not equally mean في غلط بالمفهوم انه والله الفقر بيؤدي لعنف غير صحيح. Again, let's see relatively what it means. So economic inequalities, okay, في increasing evidence that are linked to social political unrest, which might lead to violence. So in absolute terms, poverty does not mean immediately radicalization. However, economic inequalities help build up an environment that will lead young people to be frustrated, to feel excluded, to have strains on their upward mobility when they are excluded from proper job opportunities, from proper education. The alienation and frustration would lead them to have higher tendency to engage in violent extreme behavior. There's another economic factor here. when ما عنده شيء يخسره الشخص بصير وقت ما بيكون عنده opportunities يعني when they weigh the cost and benefits of engaging in violence, all right, they would tend to go into that behavior. Conclusions. So poverty in Australia is on the rise. Wealth inequality is a problem. Poverty and inequality are linked to various forms of violence. Levels of domestic violence are higher in disadvantaged socioeconomic areas. Economic inequality creates frustration, especially among youth, which might lead them to rebel and act violently. However, there is little evidence to suggest that socioeconomic factors necessarily lead to radicalization and extreme violence. So we need to differentiate between someone who goes to protest and maybe break classes, and someone really go into radicalized behavior. Recommendations I see, I'm happy to discuss it with the ladies and gentlemen, later on. So we need really to review the tax and transfer policies, especially the wealth tax in Australia. We have very little wealth tax. To ensure fairer redistribution of wealth and narrow the gap in wealth inequalities, we need to review the education policies and funding to ensure equal education, and talking about public education in different LGAs. We need to implement high effective mental health care policies with focused funding, and we definitely need to close the gender pay gap and ensure equal access to job opportunities. One thing I missed to cover in the slide is that economic disparity, what we call economic disparity among households, which is when partners own more or make more money, okay, the level of domestic violence tends to be higher. So one of the partners is at a disadvantage of the other. So we need to make sure to support the disadvantaged areas, people, and work toward more economically equal societies. Thank you very much.